Chapter 1. The Silent Offering. The auction house reeked of desperation and old money, its velvet curtains heavy with secrets that had no business seeing daylight. Sarah pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her fingers tracing the iron collar around her throat, a reminder that she was property now, not a person. The metal had rubbed her skin raw during the 3-day journey from the workhouse, but the pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest where her voice used to live. She hadn't spoken since the fire. Couldn't speak, the physician said, though they'd found nothing wrong with her throat. The trauma had stolen her words as surely as the flames had stolen everything else. Her family's bakery, her parents, her future. At 19, she was too old for the orphanages and too damaged for honest work. The workhouse had been cruel, but this was something else entirely. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. A mute girl, 19 years of age. Virgin blood, untested but certified pure by House Blackthorn's own physicians. Sarah's stomach churned. House Blackthorn, even she knew that name. One of the oldest vampire houses in England, their influence reaching into Parliament itself. She'd heard whispers that they owned half of London's docks, that their wealth had been built on centuries of careful feeding and strategic marriages between the living and the undead. The bidding began. Voices calling out numbers that meant nothing to her. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, trying to disappear into the shadows, but she could feel their gazes like ice against her skin. Vampires, most of them, though a few humans sat in the back rows. Blood dealers and house servants who bid on behalf of absent masters. £5,000. The voice cut through the others like a blade through silk. Deep and commanding with an accent she couldn't place. Old, refined, dangerous. Sarah's head snapped up despite herself, searching the crowd until her eyes found him. He sat alone in the front row, a figure carved from shadow and moonlight. Dark hair swept back from a face too beautiful to be mortal, too cold to be kind. His clothes were expensive, a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than her family's bakery had made in a year. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. They were the color of winter storms, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like prey. Lord Ashford bids 5,000, the auctioneer said, and Sarah caught the note of excitement in his voice. Apparently this was good news. Do I hear 6? 6,000. Another vampire. This one with golden hair and a cruel smile. Sarah recognized the crest on his pin, House Ravencrest, Blackthorn's oldest rival. The tension in the room shifted, became electric. 7,000. Lord Ashford again, his voice never changing, as if he were discussing the weather rather than purchasing a human being. The bidding continued, the numbers climbing higher than Sarah had ever imagined. She was worth more as livestock than her entire family had been worth alive, and the irony of it made her throat close up. Not that anyone would notice, since she couldn't speak anyway. £15,000 to Lord Ashford, the auctioneer finally declared. Going once, going twice. His gavel came down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Sold. The next few minutes passed in a blur of paperwork and whispered conversations. Sarah found herself led forward by a stern-faced woman in blackthorn colors, her wrists bound with silk rope that looked delicate, but held like steel. Up close, Lord Ashford was even more unsettling, tall enough that she had to crane her neck to look at him, with skin too pale and perfect to be human. My lord, the woman said, offering him a leather portfolio. The girl's papers. She's been tested for disease and found clean, though she's afflicted with muteness. I'm aware of her condition, he replied, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. There was something in his gaze she couldn't read. Not hunger exactly, though she'd expected that. Something more complicated. Has she been told what's expected of her? The usual terms, my lord. She's to provide blood twice weekly, remain in your household until such time as you tire of her or she dies, and obey all reasonable commands. The woman's smile was thin as paper. She cannot speak, but she can nod for yes and shake her head for no. Most find mute servants quite convenient. Lord Ashford took the papers, but didn't look at them. Leave us. The command was quiet, but the woman bowed immediately and backed away. Within moments, Sarah found herself alone with her new master in the emptying auction house. The only sounds the shuffle of other departing merchandise and the whispered conversations of satisfied buyers. "What's your name?" he asked. She stared at him, then touched her throat and shook her head. "I know you cannot speak," he said, with what might have been patience. "But you can write, I assume?" After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. He produced a silver pen from his coat and a small leather-bound notebook, offering them to her with careful hands. She noticed he wore gloves, black leather, expensive, with silver clasps at the wrists. When she took the pen, their fingers didn't touch. "Sarah," she wrote in careful script. "Sarah," he repeated, and her name sounded different in his voice, older, weighted with meaning she didn't understand. "I am Kieran Ashford, Lord of the Northern Reaches and third son of House Blackthorn." He paused, studying her face. "You're afraid?" It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. "Good," he said. "Fear will keep you alive longer than courage in my world." He closed the notebook and slipped it back into his coat. "Come. My carriage is waiting." The streets of London blurred past the carriage windows as they traveled north, away from the soot and smoke of the city centre toward the ancient estates that bordered the Thames. Sarah sat across from Lord Ashford in silence, acutely aware of every breath she took, every beat of her heart. He didn't speak during the journey, but she could feel his attention like a physical weight. The house, no, manor, that finally appeared through the fog was something out of a Gothic novel. All towers and flying buttresses, with windows that glowed like eyes in the darkness. Gargoyles perched on the corners of the roof, their stone faces twisted in eternal snarls, and ivy climbed the walls like grasping fingers. "Ravenshollow," Lord Ashford said as the carriage pulled to a stop. "It's been in my family for 8 centuries. You'll find it atmospheric." The understatement of the decade, Sarah thought as she followed him up the front steps. The massive oak doors opened before they reached them, revealing a butler so pale and still he might have been carved from marble. "Welcome home, my lord," the butler said with a bow. "I trust your business in the city was successful?" "Indeed." Lord Ashford stripped off his gloves as he spoke, revealing hands that were long-fingered and elegant, and marked with scars that looked like they might have come from claws. "This is Sarah. She'll be staying in the East Wing, in the room we prepared." The butler's gaze flicked to her collar, to the silk rope still binding her wrists, and nodded. "Of course, my lord. Shall I have Mrs. Hartwell see to her needs?" "Tomorrow. Tonight she dines with me." Lord Ashford turned to Sarah, and in the candlelight of the foyer, his eyes seemed to glow. "I have questions, and you have answers you don't even know you possess." As the butler led her deeper into the manor, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and tapestries that seemed to move in the flickering light, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her real nightmare was just beginning. She'd been sold to a vampire, yes, but there was something else. Something in the way Lord Ashford looked at her, as if she were a puzzle he needed to solve, rather than just another source of sustenance. The East Wing was warmer than the rest of the house, with actual fires burning in the grates and carpets thick enough to muffle footsteps. Her room was larger than her entire family's living quarters had been, with a 4-poster bed draped in midnight blue silk and a window that looked out over moonlit gardens. "Dinner is at 9. Miss," the butler said, setting down a tray with bread, cheese, and what looked like tea. "Lord Ashford doesn't keep London hours." When he left, Sarah sank onto the bed and finally allowed herself to shake. She was alive. She was warm. She was about to dine with a vampire who'd paid £15,000 for her blood, and she had no idea why her voice had chosen this moment, this place, to whisper back to life in her chest like a bird testing its wings. But she could feel it there, fragile and uncertain, waiting. Chapter 2. The Blood Summons. 9 o'clock came too quickly. Sarah stood before the mirror in her room, barely recognizing herself. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, apparently had appeared an hour earlier with a dress of deep emerald silk and instructions to make herself presentable for his lordship. The gown fit perfectly, which should have been impossible, and the color made her auburn hair look like flame against her pale skin. The collar was gone, She'd touched her throat obsessively, unable to believe the iron band had simply been removed while she slept. In its place was a thin silver chain, delicate as spider silk, but unbreakable when she'd tested it. A single black pearl hung at the hollow of her throat. Beautiful, but unmistakably a mark of ownership. Her reflection looked like a stranger. Like someone who belonged in a house like this, among creatures of shadow and blood. The thought made her stomach twist. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Miss, his lordship is waiting." The dining room was a study in understated elegance. Dark wood paneling, crystal chandeliers, and a table that could have seated 20, but was set for only 2. Lord Ashford stood by the fireplace, no longer wearing his coat. In just his white shirt and dark waistcoat, he looked less like a monster and more like a man, a dangerous one, but still. "You look better," he said without turning around. "Less like you're planning to bolt at the first opportunity." She almost smiled at that. "Almost. Sit," he continued, gesturing to the chair at his right hand rather than the far end of the table. "We have much to discuss." The first course appeared as if by magic, a delicate soup that smelled of herbs she couldn't identify. Lord Ashford didn't touch his bowl, but he watched her eat with the focus of a predator studying its prey. "Tell me about the fire," he said when she was halfway through the soup. Sarah's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down carefully and reached for the notebook he'd placed beside her plate. "What fire?" she wrote. His smile was sharp. "The one that killed your family. The one that took your voice. The one that brought you to my attention." Her hand trembled as she wrote. "How do you know about that?" "Because I was there," he said simply. "Not during the fire itself, but after. I was investigating a series of incidents throughout London. Fires that burned too hot, too fast, too specifically. Fires that left certain things untouched while reducing everything else to ash." The notebook fell from her numb fingers. She remembered the fire, of course she did. It lived behind her eyelids, played on endless loop through her nightmares. But she'd never told anyone about the strange parts, the impossible parts, how the flames had bent around her while everything else burned, how she'd walked through the inferno without so much as singed hair, how she'd found her parents' bodies perfectly preserved in the center of the destruction, as if the fire had knelt in reverence rather than consumed. "You're not entirely human," Lord Ashford continued, his voice gentle now. "I suspect you've always known, even if you couldn't name it. Different, set apart, capable of things that frightened you. That's impossible," she wrote, but her handwriting was shaky. "Is it? Tell me, Sarah, what happened the night you lost your voice?" She closed her eyes, remembering. She'd been trying to scream for help as the fire spread, trying to call for her parents, but instead of sound, something else had come out of her throat. Something that made the flames dance and bow, something that turned destruction into protection. The effort had torn something inside her, left her voiceless and hollow. When she opened her eyes, Lord Ashford was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Phoenix-born," he said quietly. "It's been 3 centuries since the last one was documented. Your blood doesn't just sustain life, it can resurrect it. And your voice," he leaned forward. "Your voice can command fire itself." The words hit her like a physical blow. She shook her head violently, pushing back from the table. "I know it's difficult to accept," he continued, "but it explains why House Ravencrest wanted you so badly. Why they've been tracking Phoenix-born bloodlines for decades, hoping to find one they could use. Use for what?" She managed to write. "To wake the sleeping king." The phrase meant nothing to her, but saying it changed something in Lord Ashford's face, made him look older, wearier. Vampire legend speaks of an ancient lord who was not killed but bound in death sleep by phoenix fire centuries ago. The ritual required a phoenix-born voice to seal him away, and legend says it will require another to wake him. Cassius Ravencrest believes that with the right bloodline and the right compulsion, he can control such a creature. His eyes met hers. "He's wrong, of course. But he'll destroy you trying." Sarah stared at him, trying to process. Phoenix-born, fire magic, ancient vampire kings. It sounded like madness, but it explained so much. Why she'd never quite fit anywhere. Why strange things happened around her. Why the fire had obeyed her that terrible night. Why did you buy me?" She wrote, "If you know what I am." Lord Ashford was quiet for a long moment. Because 18 months ago, something started hunting Phoenix bloodlines, tracking them down, killing them. 3 families, all descendants of the original Phoenix clans, all dead within the span of a year. Yours was the 4th, her pen stilled. You think the fire was... I think Cassius sent someone to eliminate your family and claim you. I think they underestimated your power and nearly died for it. And I think purchasing you tonight was the only way to keep you alive long enough to figure out what comes next. The dining room felt too small suddenly, the air too thick. Sarah pushed to her feet and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit gardens. Behind her, she heard Lord Ashford rise as well. "I won't lie to you," he said, his voice closer now. "You're still in danger. Ravencrest won't give up easily, and there are others who would use you for their own purposes. But here, under my protection, you have time. Time to learn what you are. Time to master your abilities." A pause. Time to decide what you want to do with the power running through your veins. She turned to face him, and was startled to find him only a few feet away. Up close, she could see the inhuman stillness of his breathing, the way shadows seemed to cling to him like old friends. "And what do you want from me in return?" His smile was sad. "Honestly, I want you to help me die." The confession hung between them like a blade. Sarah stared at him, trying to understand. "I'm old, Sarah. Older than this house. Older than the London you knew. I've seen empires rise and fall, watched plagues sweep across continents, buried more people than you could count. I'm tired." He turned away from her toward the fire. "Phoenix fire is one of the few things that can grant true death to our kind. Not the temporary death of a stake through the heart, but final rest. Peace. You want me to kill you." "I want you to choose," he corrected. "When the time comes, when you're strong enough and trained enough to survive whatever storm is coming, I want you to have the option of granting me peace. But first, we keep you alive. First, we stop Cassius from waking something that should stay sleeping." Sarah looked at this ancient creature who'd saved her from one kind of slavery only to offer her another kind of choice, and felt something shift in her chest. Not quite trust, not yet, but recognition. He was as trapped as she was, just in a different kind of cage. She picked up her pen and wrote carefully, "How do we begin?" His smile was different this time, warmer, with something that might have been hope. "Tomorrow you start learning what you truly are. Tonight." He gestured to her barely touched meal. "Tonight, you eat, you rest, and you try not to think about the fact that your voice could level this entire manor if you lost control of it. That should have been terrifying." Instead, as Sarah returned to her seat and picked up her spoon, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before the fire. The faint, fragile stirring of curiosity. She was different, dangerous, sought after by creatures out of nightmare. But for the first time in months, she wasn't alone. Chapter 3. Lessons in Fire and Blood, the screaming woke her at dawn. Sarah bolted upright in the massive bed, her heart hammering as the sound echoed through the manor. It wasn't human, too raw, too anguished, like metal being torn apart. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the noise seemed to come from inside her skull. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Sarah slipped from bed and padded to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtains to peer into the garden. Nothing moved in the pre-dawn gloom except shadows that might have been roses or might have been crouching figures. A soft knock made her jump. "Miss, are you awake?" Mrs. Hartwell stood in the hallway holding a tray, her gray hair pulled back in its usual severe bun. But there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there yesterday, and her hands shook slightly as she set down the breakfast service. What was that sound? Sarah wrote on the paper she'd taken to carrying everywhere. "Sound, miss?" Mrs. Hartwell's smile was strained. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. His lordship requests your presence in the library at 9 sharp. He's eager to begin your education." She left quickly, and Sarah noticed she didn't meet her eyes. The library turned out to be a cathedral of books. Floor-to-ceiling shelves stretched 3 stories high, connected by narrow walkways and spiral staircases that seemed to defy architectural logic. The air smelled of old leather and older secrets. and every surface that wasn't covered in books held strange artifacts. Crystal orbs, silver daggers, what looked like a collection of human teeth arranged in careful patterns. Lord Ashford sat behind a massive oak desk, still wearing yesterday's clothes. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, and there were dark stains on his shirt cuffs that made Sarah's stomach clench. "You heard it," he said without preamble. "The screaming. What was it?" "My brother." The words were flat, emotionless. "Lysander has been unwell for the past decade. Sometimes the hunger takes him, and he must be restrained until it passes." "He's here? In the house?" "The cellars. He's secured, I promise you. But the fact that you could hear him is—" He paused, studying her face. Phoenix-born have enhanced senses when it comes to supernatural distress. "You'll hear things others cannot. See things that remain hidden from mortal eyes." Sarah thought about the shadows that had seemed to move in the garden. The way the portraits in the hallways sometimes appeared to track her movement. She'd assumed it was her imagination. "Today we begin with theory," Lord Ashford continued, rising and moving to one of the bookcases. "History, bloodlines, the true nature of what you carry in your veins." He pulled down several ancient volumes, their spines cracked with age. "Tell me, what do you know of the Phoenix Wars?" "Nothing, not surprising. The church spent considerable effort erasing those records." He opened the first book, revealing pages covered in elaborate illustrations of fire and blood. 2,000 years ago, Phoenix-born were common. Not numerous, but not rare either. They served as guardians, healers, the bridge between mortal and immortal worlds. The drawings showed figures wreathed in flame, their hands glowing as they tended to the wounded or stood guard over sleeping forms that could only be vampires. The relationship was symbiotic, Lord Ashford explained. Phoenix blood could heal our kind, even bring us back from temporary death. In return, we protected the Phoenix clans from those who would abuse their power. His finger traced one of the illustrations, a woman with fire streaming from her mouth, a vampire kneeling before her. "Your people were revered, sacred. What happened?" "Fear, jealousy, the rise of Christianity, which branded anything supernatural as demonic." He turned the page, revealing scenes of burning and destruction. The Phoenix Wars weren't really wars at all. They were systematic extermination. Phoenix families hunted down and killed, their bloodlines scattered to the winds. Sarah stared at the images, recognizing something in the painted faces that looked back at her. The artist had captured an expression she knew well, the look of someone trying to hide what they truly were. "Most of the vampire houses turned their backs on the Phoenix clans," Lord Ashford continued. "Self-preservation, they called it. Better to sacrifice a few allies than risk exposure." His voice carried old anger. "House Blackthorn was different. We hid Phoenix families, helped them escape, forged new identities. It's why Cassius hates us so deeply. We chose honor over expedience. And now I'm the last." "Not quite. Our records suggest there may be 2 or 3 other bloodlines still active, but they've gone deep into hiding. You're the first we've found in 50 years. He closed the book and selected another, this one bound in what looked suspiciously like scales. "Now let's discuss what you can actually do." The next hour was a revelation of impossible things. Phoenix-born could command fire, yes, but also heal grievous wounds, see through supernatural deception, and, most importantly, speak words of power that could reshape reality in small but crucial ways. "Your voice is the key," Lord Ashford explained. "Fire responds to your will, but only when channeled through speech. The stronger your voice, the greater your control. But I can't speak. You can't speak yet," he corrected. "The trauma locked your voice away, but it's still there. I can sense it." He leaned forward, his storm-gray eyes intent. "We need to find a way to unlock it safely, before Cassius forces the issue." "How?" "Trust." The word hung between them. "Phoenix magic is tied to emotional truth. Fear, anger, despair. They can trigger your abilities, but they'll also burn you out from within. The only sustainable source of power is connection. Trust, love, if you can manage it." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying nothing beyond the facts," he interrupted. but there was something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. Phoenixborn have always formed deep bonds with their chosen vampire guardians. Not romantic attachment necessarily, but profound connection. It's how the magic stabilizes. She stared at him, trying to read the careful neutrality in his face. Yesterday he'd been a stranger who'd purchased her like livestock. Now he was talking about bonds and connection with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. And if I can't form that connection, then your power will eventually consume you. He stood, moving to stare out the tall windows. It's happened before. Phoenixborn, who tried to master their abilities alone, without an anchor. They burned from the inside out. The implications hit her like cold water. She wasn't just trapped by circumstances. She was trapped by her own nature. Without trust, without connection to this ancient creature who claimed to want only her eventual assistance in dying, she would literally burn alive. How long do I have? Hard to say. You've been suppressing your abilities since the fire, which has slowed the buildup. But eventually, he turned back to her, eventually your body will demand release. Better that it happens under controlled circumstances. As if summoned by his words, heat flared in Sarah's chest. A sudden, overwhelming warmth that made her gasp. For a moment, the air around her shimmered like summer heat, and she could swear she smelled smoke. Then it was gone, leaving her shaking. It's beginning, Lord Ashford said quietly. Your magic is waking up, whether you will it or not. He moved to her side, close enough that she could feel the unnatural chill of his skin. We need to start practical exercises today. Is it safe? His smile was sharp with old pain. Nothing about this is safe, Sarah. But it's necessary. He offered her his hand, bare this time without the gloves. Do you trust me enough to try? She looked at his outstretched palm, at the scars that marked his fingers, at the steady certainty in his eyes. 24 hours ago, she'd been livestock in an auction house. Now she was being asked to trust her life to a vampire who freely admitted he was planning to use her power to end his own existence. The smart thing would be to refuse. The safe thing would be to demand more time, more explanation, more proof that he meant what he said about protection. But the heat was building in her chest again, and she could feel something pressing against her throat, like a bird trying to escape its cage. Her magic was waking whether she was ready or not. Sarah placed her hand in his. His skin was cold as winter stone, but his grip was gentle. The moment their skin touched, she felt it. A connection that went deeper than touch, older than words. Not love, not yet, but recognition, understanding. The beginning of something that might, with time and care, become trust. Good, Lord Ashford said, and his voice carried a warmth she hadn't heard before. Now let's see what you can do. Chapter 4. The art of burning fire, Sarah discovered, was a living thing. Not alive in the way animals or plants were alive, but possessed of its own will, its own desires. It wanted to consume, to transform, to dance through the world leaving only ash and memory in its wake. Controlling it was less about dominance and more about negotiation, convincing the flames that what she wanted aligned with their nature. Don't force it, Lord Ashford said for the dozenth time as smoke curled from her fingertips. Fire responds to invitation, not command. They were in what he called the practice room, a stone chamber deep in the manor's basement that looked like it had been designed specifically for containing magical disasters. Scorch marks decorated the walls in abstract patterns, and the air smelled of sulfur and old magic. Sarah closed her eyes and tried again, focusing on the sensation of warmth in her chest, rather than the frustration building behind her ribs. Come, she thought, imagining the words she couldn't speak. Dance with me. This time, the flame that sparked from her palm was steady, no larger than a candle's flicker, but controlled. She held it there for a full minute before it guttered out, leaving her gasping with effort. Better, Lord Ashford said, and she could hear approval in his voice. You're beginning to understand. Fire isn't your servant, it's your partner, she nodded, wiping sweat from her forehead. They'd been at this for 3 hours, and she felt like she'd run a marathon. Every small success left her drained, every failure filled her with the bitter taste of smoke. Why is this so difficult? she wrote during their break. In the stories, magic just happens. Stories lie, he replied, settling beside her on the stone bench that was the room's only furniture. Magic is like any other skill. It requires practice, patience, and acceptance of failure as part of the learning process. The fact that you're progressing this quickly is actually remarkable. It doesn't feel remarkable. 3 days ago, you couldn't produce so much as a spark. Now you can maintain a flame for a full minute. Trust me. That's exceptional progress for someone who's been suppressing their abilities for months. Sarah looked at him sideways, studying his profile in the dim light. He'd shed his coat and rolled up his sleeves for the lesson, revealing arms that were lean and scarred. Some of the marks looked old, centuries old, while others appeared more recent. How long have you been teaching Phoenixborn? You're my first, he admitted. I've studied the theory extensively, but actual instruction... He shrugged. We're both learning as we go. The confession should have been alarming, but instead, Sarah found it oddly comforting. She wasn't just a student, she was a partner in this strange education. Tell me about your brother. Lord Ashford's expression tightened. What do you want to know? Why is he in the cellars? What happened to him? For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, the sound carrying centuries of weariness. Lysander was turned during the plague years, the Black Death. He was barely 20, dying in the streets when I found him. His hands clenched into fists. I thought I was saving him. Instead, I damned him to this. You're his sire, yes, and my blood runs stronger than most, older, more concentrated. It should have made him powerful, stable. Instead, he trailed off, staring at the scorch marks on the walls. Instead, he never learned to control the hunger. It comes in waves, consuming everything he is until only the beast remains. Is that why you want to die? Because of him? Partly. Lord Ashford turned to look at her, and she was startled by the raw pain in his eyes. Every vampire I've sired carries some fragment of my darkness. Every death they cause, every innocent they drain. It's my responsibility. My burden, how many? Dozens. Over the centuries, I created dozens of vampires thinking I was granting them eternal life. Instead, I cursed them with eternal hunger. He stood abruptly, pacing to the far wall. Phoenix fire can break that curse. Not just grant me death, but true rest. Peace. An end to the guilt. Sarah watched him, seeing for the first time the weight he carried. It wasn't just weariness that made him move like an old man. Despite his youthful appearance, it was guilt, self-recrimination, the accumulated suffering of centuries spent watching his children struggle with monsters he'd placed inside them. She stood and moved to where he'd stopped, placing her hand on his arm. His skin was cold even through the fabric of his shirt, but he didn't pull away. You can't save them all, she wrote when he looked at her. But you saved me, did I? Or did I simply trade one form of slavery for another? His smile was bitter. You're here because you need to be, not because you chose to be. That's not salvation, that's expedience. The heat flared in her chest again, stronger this time. Not the controlled warmth of magic practice, but something rawer. Anger, maybe, or frustration at his willful blindness to his own decency. You're wrong, she said. The words came out as barely a whisper. Rough and cracked from months of disuse, but they were audible. Real. Both of them froze, staring at each other in shock. You spoke, Lord Ashford breathed. You're wrong, she repeated, louder this time, though her throat burned with the effort. You didn't save me because you had to. You saved me because you could. Because it was right. The words came faster now, as if months of silence had created a dam that was finally breaking. Maybe you made mistakes with others, but you're not making mistakes with me. Fire bloomed around her hands without conscious effort, wreathing her fingers in golden flame that cast dancing shadows on the walls. But it didn't hurt. It felt like coming home, like finally breathing after holding her breath for too long. Sarah? He reached toward her, then stopped, his hand hovering inches from the flames. I trust you, she said, and knew it was true. Somewhere between his careful lessons and quiet confessions, between his gentle hands and wounded eyes, trust had grown like a plant in fertile soil. I choose to trust you, The flames around her hands pulsed brighter, and she felt the magic settle into her bones like it belonged there. No longer fighting for control, no longer burning to escape, just present, patient, waiting for her direction. Lord Ashford's smile was different this time. Soft. Real. Then we're ready for the next step. Later, much later, Sarah sat in the library with one of the ancient books open in her lap. Her throat was raw from speaking. She'd spent the rest of the lesson practicing words along with fire control, but the discomfort felt earned. Useful. Lord Ashford had left to check on his brother, promising to return within the hour. Alone among the books and artifacts, Sarah felt the weight of the manor's age settling around her like a familiar cloak. This was a place built for creatures like her, beings caught between mortal and immortal, human and other. The book in her lap contained genealogies of Phoenix bloodlines, family trees that stretched back centuries. She'd been searching for her own name, her own family, but the records were incomplete. Whole branches had been marked with symbols she was beginning to recognize as death markers. Flames crossed with swords, indicating violent ends. So much loss. So much fear and hiding and premature death, but also something else. In the margins of the older entries, she found notes written in different hands, locations where survivors had been spotted, new identities that had been carefully constructed, evidence that even during the darkest periods of persecution, someone had been keeping track. Someone had been trying to preserve what remained. The handwriting in the margins was familiar. She'd seen it on the lesson notes Lord Ashford had prepared for her. He'd been documenting Phoenix bloodlines for centuries, not hunting them, but protecting them. Watching from the shadows as families scattered and reformed, new generations born carrying spark and flame in their blood. Finding anything interesting? His voice came from directly behind her, but she didn't startle. She was beginning to recognize the particular quality of silence that surrounded him. Not absence of sound, but presence of something that existed outside normal perception. "You've been tracking us for a long time," she said, turning to face him. Her voice was stronger now, though still hoarse. Someone had to. He moved around the chair to face her, and she could see exhaustion in the set of his shoulders. "How is Lysander?" "Sleeping, finally. The episodes are getting worse." He sank into the chair across from her, suddenly looking every one of his centuries. "Some nights I wonder if it wouldn't be kinder to end his suffering." "But you don't." "No. He has lucid moments, periods where he's himself again. During those times," he shook his head, "during those times he begs me not to give up on him. How do you weigh momentary clarity against centuries of torment?" Sarah closed the book and set it aside, giving him her full attention. "You said Phoenix fire could break the curse." "Theoretically. But the process," he met her eyes, "it would require you to speak words of unbinding directly to a vampire in the grip of blood rage. If your control slipped even slightly, if the fire decided to consume rather than cleanse, you could burn him to ash instead of freeing him." The implications hit her immediately. He wasn't just asking her to eventually grant him death. He was hoping she might save his brother. All the careful lessons, the patient instruction, the gentle coaxing of her abilities. It wasn't just about her power or his guilt. It was about love. "You want me to try to heal him?" "I want you to be strong enough to make that choice," he corrected. "When you're ready, when your control is perfect, when you understand fully what you're capable of, then we'll discuss whether it's possible. And if I fail, if I kill him instead of curing him," Lord Ashford's smile was sad but genuine, "then at least his suffering ends. Sometimes that's the kindest gift we can offer." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of unspoken possibilities settling between them. Outside the library windows, night was falling, and Sarah could hear the manor coming alive around them. Footsteps in distant corridors, doors opening and closing. The soft murmur of servants going about their evening duties. "There's something else," Lord Ashford said eventually. "Something I should have told you earlier." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "What?" "The auction where I found you. It wasn't random. Cassius knew you would be there because someone told him." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Someone within House Blackthorn has been feeding information to Ravencrest." "A spy," the words hit her like cold water. "Someone in this house?" Possibly. Or someone with access to our records, our movements. It's why I've been keeping your training location secret. Why Mrs. Hartwell has been told you're simply a new blood servant. He ran a hand through his dark hair. I don't know who we can trust, except each other. Except each other, he agreed. Which is why tomorrow we accelerate your training. No more gentle lessons and gradual progress. If there's a spy, they'll report your growing abilities eventually. We need you combat ready before that happens. Combat ready. The phrase sent a chill down her spine. You think they'll come for me? I think Cassius will do whatever it takes to claim you. And that includes attacking my home directly if necessary. Lord Ashford's eyes glinted in the firelight, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of the predator beneath his civilized exterior. But he's underestimated both of us. He thinks you're just another frightened blood servant, and he thinks I'm too old and tired to fight effectively. Aren't you? His smile was all teeth. Ask me again after you've seen what 8 centuries of accumulated rage can accomplish. Despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, the impossible situation she'd found herself in, Sarah felt a flicker of something that might have been excitement. For the first time since the fire, she wasn't just surviving, she was preparing to fight back. Tomorrow then, she said, standing and moving toward the door. We see what I'm really capable of, Sarah? His voice stopped her at the threshold. Thank you. For what? For choosing to trust me. For giving me something to protect besides my own guilt. He stood as well, and in the lamplight he looked younger somehow, less burdened. It's been a long time since I had something to hope for. As she walked back to her room through corridors lined with watching portraits, Sarah thought about hope, about trust and connection, and the strange alchemy that was transforming her from victim to something else, something dangerous. Behind her, she could swear she heard the faint sound of someone screaming in the depths of the house. But this time, instead of fear, the sound filled her with determination. Tomorrow, she would learn to burn. Chapter 5. Blood and betrayal, the attack came at dawn. Sarah woke not to screaming this time, but to silence, the absolute, unnatural quiet that falls over a house when every living thing within its walls holds its breath and waits. She slipped from bed and moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtains to peer into the garden. The roses were wrong. They stood too still in the morning breeze, their red blooms too bright, too uniform. As she watched, one of the flowers turned toward her window with deliberate intent, revealing not petals, but rows of needle-sharp teeth. Blood roses, a voice said behind her. Cassius always did have a flair for the dramatic. She spun around to find Lord Ashford in her doorway, but not as she'd ever seen him. Gone was the carefully civilized gentleman in expensive clothes. This creature was something else entirely. Eyes like winter storms, fangs visible even when his mouth was closed, an aura of barely controlled violence that made the air itself seem dangerous. How many? She asked, her voice still rough but stronger than it had been yesterday. 50, perhaps 60. They've surrounded the house. He moved to stand beside her at the window, and she could feel the cold radiating from his skin. Cassius himself is with them. I can smell his particular brand of arrogance from here. As if summoned by his words, a figure stepped from the shadow of the garden maze. Tall, golden-haired, beautiful in the way that predatory things were beautiful. Sarah recognized him immediately as the vampire who'd bid against Lord Ashford at the auction. Lord Ashford. Cassius called, his voice carrying easily through the glass. I've come for what's mine by right. Send out the Phoenix-born, and we can avoid unnecessary bloodshed. You're right? Lord Ashford's laugh was like breaking glass. Since when do Ravencrests have rights to anything beyond their own delusions? Since we discovered that your precious bloodline isn't quite as pure as you pretend. Cassius smiled, and even from a distance, Sarah could see his fangs. Did you really think we wouldn't investigate? House Blackthorn has been harboring Phoenix-born for centuries, breeding them like livestock, weakening their power with vampire blood until they're nothing but pretty pets with party tricks. Sarah felt ice form in her veins. What is he talking about? Lord Ashford's expression had gone carefully blank. Sarah, what is he talking about? She repeated, turning to face him fully. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his shoulders sagged, and she saw something die behind his eyes. Phoenix-born and vampires, when they form deep bonds, when they trust completely, sometimes the connection becomes permanent. Blood calls to blood, and over time... He couldn't meet her gaze. Over time, the Phoenix blood becomes diluted, changed, still powerful, but not as pure as it once was. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. You knew this would happen, and you didn't tell me. I hoped it wouldn't matter. I hoped we'd have time to what? Turn me into some kind of vampire hybrid? Fire bloomed around her hands without conscious thought, hot enough that the window glass began to crack. Is that what this has all been about? Not protection, but cultivation? No. The word came out sharp enough to cut. Sarah, you have to believe me. I never intended— Tick-tock, Kieran! Cassius called from below. My patience wears thin and your roses are looking quite hungry. As if responding to their master's voice, the blood roses throughout the garden began to move, their thorny stems writhing like serpents as they crept closer to the house. Where they touched the walls, stone began to crack and bleed. We don't have time for this, Lord Ashford said urgently. Whatever you think of me now, whatever I've done wrong, Cassius will do worse. He doesn't want to dilute your power. He wants to drain it entirely. Use it to wake something that should stay sleeping. Sarah stared at him, trying to read truth from deception in his storm-gray eyes. The fire around her hands pulsed brighter, responding to her emotional turmoil. How do I know you're not lying now? Because, he said quietly, if I wanted to drain your power, I've had dozens of opportunities over the past week. Instead, I've been teaching you to strengthen it, to control it, to use it as a weapon. He stepped closer, and she could see desperation in his face. I've been teaching you to be dangerous to me. Before she could respond, the house shuddered. Plaster rained from the ceiling as something massive struck the front door. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th impact, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the manor. They're inside, Lord Ashford said, his civilized mask sliding back into place. Stay close to me. No matter what happens, don't let them separate us. They moved through the corridors like ghosts, Lord Ashford leading with predatory grace while Sarah followed, fire dancing around her fingers in nervous spirals. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of invasion, furniture being overturned, artwork being destroyed, footsteps that moved too quickly and too quietly to be human. The library, Lord Ashford whispered as they reached a junction of hallways. There's a passage behind the genealogy section that leads to... A figure dropped from the ceiling directly in front of them. Female, with silver hair and eyes like chips of ice. She wore modern clothes, but moved with the fluid grace of something that had been hunting for centuries. When she smiled, her fangs caught the morning light streaming through the windows. Hello, Uncle, she said to Lord Ashford with mock sweetness. Fancy meeting you here, Uncle. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the implications hit her. Helena, Lord Ashford said carefully. I should have known. Should have known what? That your favorite niece might have her own opinions about family loyalty? That she might get tired of watching House Blackthorn coddle humans while our real enemies grow stronger? Helena's gaze shifted to Sarah, and her smile widened. Or should you have known that Cassius pays very well for information about Phoenix bloodlines? The spy. The traitor who'd been feeding information to House Ravencrest was family. You sold me out, Sarah said, her voice carrying more hurt than anger. Before we'd even met, you were planning to betray me. Nothing personal, little Phoenix. But you're wasted on Kieran. He's too old, too soft, too wrapped up in his own guilt to use you properly. Cassius, on the other hand, she licked her lips. Cassius understands that power is meant to be taken. Not coddled, fire exploded from Sarah's hands. Not the controlled flame she'd been practicing, but raw, desperate heat that turned the air itself into a weapon. Helena moved faster than human eyes could follow. But the fire was faster. It caught her across the shoulder, spinning her into the wall with a scream of pain and rage. Run, Lord Ashford said, pushing Sarah toward the library. I'll handle her. I'm not leaving you. That's an order. His voice carried compulsion now, the weight of centuries pressing against her will. Get to the passage. Get to safety. I'll find you. Sarah ran. Behind her, she heard the sound of inhuman combat, Snarling, the crash of bodies against walls, Helena's voice raised in fury. But she didn't look back. Couldn't look back. Not with Lord Ashford's command burning in her mind like a brand. The library doors stood open, hanging askew on their hinges. Books lay scattered across the floor, their ancient pages torn and trampled. Someone had been here before her, searching for something. Or someone. There you are. Cassius stepped from behind one of the tall bookcases, still immaculately dressed despite the violence of the morning. Up close, he was even more beautiful than she'd realized. The kind of beauty that belonged in marble sculptures or oil paintings. Perfect and cold and utterly without mercy. I was beginning to think Kieran had hidden you away in some secret chamber, he continued conversationally. Though I suppose this is better, more dramatic, more appropriate for what's about to happen. Sarah backed toward the genealogy section, fire building around her hands. Stay away from me, oh my dear child. You misunderstand completely. His smile was gentle, almost paternal. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to offer you the truth about what you really are. I know what I am. Do you? Did Kieran tell you that Phoenix blood grows stronger with each generation? That you, as potentially the last of your line, carry the accumulated power of centuries in your veins? He took a step closer, and she could see golden flecks in his pale eyes. Did he mention that with proper guidance, you could burn this entire city to ash and rebuild it in your image? Despite herself, Sarah felt a flicker of curiosity. What proper guidance? The kind that doesn't come with guilt and hesitation and requests for mercy. Cassius gestured around the destroyed library. Kieran has spent 8 centuries apologizing for his nature. I've spent mine embracing it. Which of us do you think understands power better? Heat pulsed in her chest, responding to something in his voice. Not attraction. He was too cold, too calculating for that. But recognition of a different kind. He was offering her something Lord Ashford never had. Permission to stop hiding what she was. You want to use me to wake the sleeping king. I want to help you wake yourself. He was close enough now that she could smell him. Expensive cologne over something darker, older, tinged with blood and darkness. The sleeping king is just the beginning, Sarah. With him as an ally, with your power as a weapon, we could remake the world. No more hiding in shadows. No more pretending to be less than we are. The flames around her hands wavered, responding to the conflict in her mind. It would be easy to say yes. Easy to stop fighting her nature. Stop apologizing for the fire that wanted to consume everything in its path. Then she heard screaming from somewhere deeper in the house. Not the inhuman sound of Lysander in the grip of blood rage, but something else. Something that sounded like Mrs. Hartwell. What have you done? She whispered. Cassius's smile widened. What was necessary? Your vampire guardian has certain attachments that make him predictable. Did you really think I'd come here without insurance? The servants. The humans who'd shown her kindness, who'd tried to make her feel welcome in this strange place. Cassius had taken them hostage to ensure Lord Ashford's cooperation. The fire around Sarah's hands flared white-hot, and for the first time since awakening her voice, she felt the old familiar pressure building in her throat. Not words this time, but something else. Something that might shake the foundations of the house if she let it free. Let them go, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. Now that, Cassius said with genuine pleasure, sounds like a phoenix about to roar. Show me what you can do, little flame. Show me why you're worth all this trouble. Sarah opened her mouth and let the fire speak. Chapter 6. The Phoenix Roars. The sound that came from Sarah's throat was not quite scream, not quite song. It was the voice of flame itself, raw, primal, carrying the memory of every fire that had ever burned. The library windows exploded outward in a shower of glass and light. Ancient books burst into flame, their knowledge feeding the growing conflagration. The very air seemed to catch fire, turning the space into a miniature sun. Cassius threw himself backward, his perfect face twisted with shock and something that might have been fear. Where Sarah's voice touched him, his clothes began to smolder. Impossible, he breathed. No Phoenix-born has commanded that level of power in 3 centuries. Sarah could feel the fire spreading beyond her control, reaching through the house like hungry fingers. This was what Lord Ashford had warned her about, the consuming nature of unanchored power. Without trust, without connection, the flames would devour everything. But she wasn't unanchored anymore. Even as the fire raged around her, she felt it, the thin silver thread of connection that bound her to Lord Ashford. Not the diluting bond that Cassius had spoken of, but something else entirely, something that let her draw on his strength while keeping her power pure. The flames shifted, becoming more focused. Instead of wild destruction, they moved with purpose, creating a barrier between her and Cassius while leaving the structural bones of the library intact. "Fascinating," Cassius said, circling the wall of fire like a predator studying prey. "You've learned to channel through the bond without losing yourself to it. Kieran has taught you well." "He taught me to trust," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the power coursing through her. "Something you'll never understand. Trust?" Cassius laughed, the sound like breaking crystal. "Is that what you call it when someone hides the truth about what your bond will cost you? When they fail to mention that every day you spend connected to vampire blood brings you closer to becoming something that's neither fully human nor truly immortal?" The words hit like physical blows, but Sarah didn't let the flames waver. "What are you talking about? You're changing, little Phoenix. Can't you feel it? The way your senses are sharpening, the way you no longer need as much sleep or food, the way you heal faster than you should?" His smile was cruel. "Give it another month and you'll be something entirely new. A hybrid creature that's never existed before." She could feel it, now that he'd given the changes names. The way shadows seemed less absolute. The way she could hear conversations from 3 floors away. The way the cut on her hand from yesterday's lesson had disappeared by morning. "Kieran should have told you," Cassius continued. "Should have given you the choice to accept or reject the transformation. Instead, he let it happen without your knowledge or consent. Is that the trust you're so proud of?" Doubt crept through her like poison, making the flames flicker. Maybe Cassius was right. Maybe Lord Ashford had been using her from the beginning, just more subtly than House Ravencrest would have. Then she heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of flames and the whisper of doubt. Helena's laughter, high and cruel, echoing from somewhere deeper in the house, and underneath it, a sound she'd come to know too well. Lysander screaming. They hadn't just taken the human servants hostage. They'd done something to Lord Ashford's brother. The fire around Sarah turned from gold to white-hot silver, the heat so intense that even Cassius stepped back. "Where is he?" she demanded. "Who? Your precious vampire lord? Oh, he's alive, for now. But my dear niece Helena has always had a talent for causing pain, and she's been wanting to pay him back for centuries of disappointment." Cassius examined his nails with elaborate casualness. "I imagine she's showing him exactly what she thinks of his protective instincts." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not the heat of fire, but something colder. More focused. The kind of rage that didn't burn wild but cut with surgical precision. "You made a mistake," she said quietly. "Did I? You assumed I was just another frightened girl who needed protection." The flames around her changed again, becoming almost liquid in their movement. "You assumed wrong." She didn't wait for his response. Instead, she reached through the silver thread that connected her to Lord Ashford, following it like a lifeline through the maze of the house. The bond that Cassius had claimed would weaken her became her strength, showing her exactly where she needed to go. The cellars. Sarah moved through the house like a force of nature, fire streaming behind her like a cloak. Servants, the few who were still free, pressed themselves against walls as she passed, their eyes wide with terror and awe. She didn't stop to reassure them. There wasn't time. Behind her, she could hear Cassius following, his footsteps silent but his presence unmistakable. He was curious now, wanting to see what she would do with all that power, expecting her to lose control, to burn herself out in a spectacular display that would leave her empty and vulnerable. He was going to be disappointed. The door to the cellars had been torn from its hinges. Beyond it, stone steps led down into darkness that reeked of blood and older things. Sarah descended without hesitation, the fire around her providing more light than any torch. At the bottom, she found them. Lord Ashford was chained to the wall with silver bonds, his shirt torn away to reveal a torso covered in precise cuts. Helena crouched beside him like a cat playing with wounded prey, her fingers dripping red as she worked. But it was the scene in the corner that made Sarah's heart stop. Lysander hung from chains of his own, but these weren't restraints. They were the only thing keeping him upright. Someone had driven wooden stakes through his shoulders, pinning him like a butterfly in a collector's case. His eyes, when they found hers, were lucid for the first time since she'd been in the house. "Run," he whispered through blood-stained lips. "Please, don't let them use you." "How touching," Helena said without looking up from her work. The mad vampire has a moment of clarity. "Don't worry, Uncle. I'll make sure it doesn't last long." The silver knife in her hand gleamed as she raised it toward Lysander's throat. Sarah let the phoenix roar again. This time, the sound was focused, controlled, carrying all her rage and determination in a single note of absolute command. Helena froze mid-motion as the fire swept over her, not burning but binding, turning the air around her into chains that held her motionless. "Let them go," Sarah said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the stone walls tremble. "I don't think so," Cassius said from the doorway. "You see, my dear, you've just demonstrated exactly why we need you. That level of control, that precision, it's exactly what we need to wake the sleeping king safely. I said let them go, and I said no." His smile was indulgent, paternal. "Helena, kill the mad one. Let's see if that motivates our little phoenix to be more cooperative." Helena strained against the fire chains, her face twisted with effort. Slowly, impossibly, the knife began to move toward Lysander's throat. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. Not her power, but her restraint. The careful control Lord Ashford had taught her, the measured responses, the fear of what she might become if she truly let go, all of it shattered like glass. The fire that erupted from her wasn't the controlled flames of the library or the binding heat she'd used on Helena. This was the fire that had protected her during her family's death, raw and primal and absolutely merciless. It swept through the cellar like a living thing, burning away the silver chains that held Lord Ashford, melting the stakes that pinned Lysander, reducing Helena's knife to slag in her hand, but it didn't touch the brothers themselves. Instead, it flowed around them like water around stones, recognizing on some fundamental level that these were creatures under her protection. Helena screamed as the fire found her, not burning her flesh but something deeper, searing away the vampire strength that let her resist, leaving her mortal weak and gasping on the stone floor. "Impossible," Cassius breathed. "Phoenix fire doesn't just burn, it transforms. But that level of discrimination, that ability to choose what changes and what remains." His eyes widened with something like religious awe. "You're not just Phoenix-born. You're the Phoenix Eternal, the one the prophecies spoke of." Sarah turned to face him, and in her eyes was the accumulated fury of her murdered family, her stolen voice, her weeks of fear and uncertainty. "I don't care what I am," she said, and her voice carried the crackle of flames and the whisper of ashes. "I only care what I choose to do with it." The fire reached for Cassius like a lover's caress, and for the first time in centuries, the ancient vampire knew fear. Chapter 7. Blood and Ashes. Cassius was fast, faster than anything human had a right to be, but Sarah's fire was faster. It caught him at the threshold of the cellar, wrapping around his legs like golden rope, holding him in place as the flames began their work. Not burning, not yet, but changing. She could feel his vampire strength beginning to ebb, just as it had with Helena. "Wait," he gasped, his perfect composure finally cracking. "You don't understand what you're doing. Without vampire blood, without the old covenants, the sleeping king will wake on his own. The binding grows weaker every year." Sarah paused, though the fire continued to hold him motionless. "What binding?" "The one your ancestors created during the Phoenix Wars. They didn't just scatter to escape persecution. They sacrificed themselves to contain something far worse." His breathing was labored now, mortality creeping through his system like poison, an ancient vampire lord who fed not just on blood, but on life itself, who could drain entire cities with a thought. "You're lying." "Am I?" asked Kieran. He was there when the binding was created. He watched your people burn themselves to ash to keep that monster sleeping. Cassius's smile was pained but genuine. "Why do you think he's so eager to die? He's been carrying the guilt of that sacrifice for 2,000 years. Against her will, Sarah found herself looking toward Lord Ashford. He was free of the silver chains now, but hadn't moved from the wall, his storm-gray eyes fixed on her face with an expression she couldn't read. "Is it true?" she asked. "Partially." His voice was rough, damaged from whatever Helena had done to him. "There was a binding, and Phoenix-born did die to create it. But not the way he's describing. Then how?" Lord Ashford pushed away from the wall, moving to help his brother down from the chains that had held him. Lysander was conscious but weak, leaning heavily on his sire's support. "The sleeping king wasn't bound by sacrifice," Lord Ashford said carefully. "He was bound by love. By a phoenix-born who chose to link her life force to his, creating a prison of connection that could only be broken by her death or his." "And?" Sarah prompted when he fell silent. "And she's been sleeping beside him for 2 millennia, keeping him contained through sheer force of will." Lord Ashford's eyes met hers. "Her name was Lyrelai. She was the Phoenix Eternal before you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not the last of her kind, the latest in a line stretching back through centuries of sacrifice and duty. "What happened to her?" "She's dying," Cassius said from where the fire held him. "The binding is killing her by degrees, and when she finally fades, he'll wake. Unless..." He smiled, and despite his weakened state, there was still something predatory in the expression. "Unless another Phoenix Eternal takes her place. That's what you want from me. Not to wake him, but to replace her." "I want you to have the choice she never had," Cassius corrected. Lyrelai bound herself willingly, but she was young, inexperienced, unaware of what the sacrifice would truly cost. You have power she never dreamed of, control she never achieved. You could do more than just contain him. You could reshape him. The fire around Sarah's hands flickered as the implications sank in. Replace one eternal prison with another. Spend eternity bound to a monster, keeping him contained through constant vigilance and the slow erosion of her own life. Force. There has to be another way, she said. "There is." Lord Ashford had settled Lysander on the stone. Florin was checking his injuries with gentle hands. Phoenix fire doesn't just bind or contain, it can also destroy, completely, finally. But destroying something that powerful, something that's been sleeping for 2,000 years. He looked up at her, and she saw centuries of weariness in his face. "The backlash would likely kill you, and anyone else connected to you through blood or bond. Anyone connected to her." The silver thread that bound her to Lord Ashford pulsed with shared understanding. If she tried to destroy the sleeping king, she would die, and she would take him with her. "So my choices are eternal imprisonment or mutual destruction," she said flatly. "Unless," Helena said from where she lay on the cellar floor, her voice weak but venomous, "you choose the third option." All eyes turned to her. She was mortal now. Sarah's fire had burned away her vampire nature as surely as if she'd never been turned at all. But her mind was still sharp, still calculating. What third option? Sarah asked against her better judgment. Join with him instead of binding him. The sleeping king isn't evil in any way you'd recognize. He's just hungry. Always hungry. But if he had a willing partner, someone whose life force could sustain him without being drained... Helena's smile was terrible. He could be satisfied, contained, and you could share in his power instead of being consumed by it. "Absolutely not," Lord Ashford said sharply. "Why?" Helena challenged. "Because it offends your moral sensibilities? Because you'd rather see her die pure than live compromised?" She struggled to sit up, her human frailty making the effort visibly painful. "At least my way, she survives. Your way, she burns herself to ash for the sake of noble sacrifice." Sarah looked between them, feeling the weight of impossible choices. In the span of a week, she'd gone from voiceless servant to the last hope of containing an ancient evil. Every option led to loss, of life, of freedom, of the humanity she'd only just begun to reclaim. How long do we have? She asked. Until what? Cassius replied. Until she dies. Until he wakes up. Until I have to choose. Lord Ashford and Cassius exchanged glances, the first moment of cooperation she'd seen between them. Months, Lord Ashford said finally. Perhaps a year if we're fortunate. Lyrelai has been failing for the past decade and the rate of decline is accelerating. And if I do nothing, if I refuse all three options, then in a year's time, something that can drain the life from entire continents will wake up angry, hungry, and completely uncontrolled, Cassius said. The binding will shatter, and there will be no phoenix-born powerful enough to create a new one. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the fire inside her chest pulse with each heartbeat. A year to master abilities that had taken the previous Phoenix Eternal a lifetime to understand. A year to choose between death, eternal servitude, or unholy alliance with a monster. I need time to think, she said. Time is the one thing we don't have, Helena pointed out. Then we make time. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at each of them in turn. Ancient vampire lord, mad brother, turncoat niece, centuries-old enemy. We find Lyrelai. We talk to her. We learn what she knows about the Sleeping King, and why she chose binding over destruction. She's been asleep for 2,000 years, Lord Ashford said gently. Even if we could reach her, even if she's still aware enough to communicate, then we wake her up. The fire around Sarah flared brighter, responding to her determination. Phoenix fire can transform anything, right? If I can burn away vampire nature, if I can bind or destroy, then I can certainly wake up one sleeping phoenix-born. The risk is mine to take. She looked at Lord Ashford, seeing her own fear reflected in his eyes. You said you wanted to give me choices. This is me choosing. The silence that followed was broken by Lysander's weak laughter. Sister, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're going to get us all killed. Probably, Sarah agreed. But at least we'll die knowing we tried every option. She turned toward the cellar stairs, fire streaming behind her like a banner. At the threshold, she paused. Cassius, Helena, you can either help us find a fourth option, or you can get in our way. But understand this. If you betray us again, if you put any more innocents at risk, I'll do to you what I did to your vampire nature. Permanently. As she climbed the stairs, leaving the others to follow or not as they chose, Sarah felt something new settling into her chest alongside the fire. Not just power, but purpose. For the first time since the night her family died, she knew exactly what she was fighting for. Not just survival. Not just freedom, but the right to choose her own fate, even if that fate was darkness. Chapter 8, The Sleeping Phoenix. The journey to find Lyrelai took them beneath London itself. 3 days of preparation had yielded maps that shouldn't exist. Ancient charts showing tunnels and chambers that predated Roman occupation, marked with symbols that made Sarah's eyes water when she looked at them directly. Lord Ashford spread them across the library table while the unlikely alliance gathered around. The binding site is here, he said, pointing to a complex of chambers deep beneath the Thames, nearly 2 miles down, in caverns that were old when the first humans arrived in Britain. Cassius, still weakened, but recovering his strength slowly, leaned over the map. The approach tunnels are warded. Phoenix fire should be able to burn through them, but what? Sarah asked. But they were designed to keep things in, not out. The closer we get, the more unstable they'll become. One wrong step, one loss of control, and the entire complex could collapse. Helena, sitting apart from the group and still adjusting to her restored mortality, laughed bitterly. Assuming we can even reach the site, there are guardians in those tunnels. Things that were old when I was young, bound to kill anything that tries to approach the Sleeping King. What kind of guardians? Sarah asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. The failed Phoenix-born, Lord Ashford said quietly. Those who tried to create their own binding over the centuries and didn't survive the process intact. Sarah felt ice form in her veins despite the fire constantly warming her skin. They're still alive? After a fashion. The binding process changes them, twists them into something that's neither fully living nor properly dead. They exist only to protect the site, to kill anyone who might disturb the balance. And you want me to walk into that? I want you to have all the information before you decide, Lord Ashford corrected. The Guardians will recognize you as Phoenix-born, but that doesn't mean they'll let you pass. They've been alone for centuries, mad with isolation and the constant exposure to the Sleeping King's dreams. Lysander, who had been silent through most of the planning, finally spoke from where he sat propped against the wall. His dreams leak out into everything within a mile radius. It's why the Guardians went mad, why no human settlement has ever lasted in that part of London. Lord Ashford rolled up one of the maps with careful hands. When something that powerful sleeps, it doesn't rest quietly. What does he dream about? Sarah found herself asking. Hunger, Cassius said simply. Endless, consuming hunger. But also, he paused, looking uncomfortable. Also longing, loneliness, the dreams of something that was never meant to exist alone. The group fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Sarah stared at the remaining maps, trying to imagine what they would find in the depths. A sleeping monster surrounded by the mad remnants of would-be heroes, guarded by nightmares made manifest, with only a dying Phoenix-born standing between it and the world above. When do we leave? She asked. We? Lord Ashford's eyebrows rose. Sarah, you can't seriously be considering taking all of us down there. Why not? You know the history. Cassius knows the theory. Helena knows Ravencrest tactics. And Lysander. She looked at the younger vampire, seeing something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. A clarity that went beyond his moments of lucidity. Lysander understands madness. We'll need that. I won't be responsible for leading you into that darkness, Lord Ashford said firmly. Then don't lead. Follow. Sarah stood, fire blooming around her hands with unconscious authority. This is my choice to make, my risk to take. But I won't make it alone, and I won't make it ignorant. For a moment, the ancient vampire lord looked as if he might argue. Then something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, of the futility of trying to protect someone who had already chosen her path. Tomorrow night, then, he said. We go tomorrow night. The entrance to the Undercity was hidden in the basement of a burned-out church in Southwark. Sarah stood before the heavy iron door, feeling the weight of ancient power pressing against her senses like a physical thing. The others gathered behind her, Lord Ashford in his traveling clothes, Cassius still pale but determined, Helena armed with weapons she claimed would work against inhuman guardians, and Lysander wrapped in a cloak that couldn't quite hide his trembling. Last chance to reconsider, Lord Ashford said quietly. Sarah placed her hand on the iron door and felt it respond to her touch, not opening exactly, but recognizing what she was. The metal grew warm, then hot, then began to glow with internal fire. I've been reconsidering for 3 days, she replied. The answer is still the same. The door dissolved under her touch, revealing a tunnel that stretched into absolute darkness. The air that flowed out was thick with age and something else, a sweetness that made her think of flowers left too long in water. Phoenix fire will light our way, Lord Ashford said. But try to keep the flames contained. We don't know what else might be sleeping down here. They descended in single file, Sarah leading with fire dancing around her like a living crown. The tunnel was older than anything she'd ever seen, walls carved from living rock, floor worn smooth by the passage of countless feet over countless centuries. Strange symbols marked the walls at regular intervals, and each one made her fire pulse brighter. Markers, Cassius explained when she asked. Each one indicates a different ward, a different protection. We're walking through layers of containment that took centuries to create. And we're just walking through them? Phoenix fire burns through everything, Helena said from behind them. That's rather the point. As they went deeper, the air grew thicker, more oppressive. Sarah found herself breathing harder despite not needing as much air as she once had. Behind her, she could hear Lysander's increasingly labored breathing, and the soft whispered conversations between Lord Ashford and Cassius as they recognized landmarks from their own ancient memories. The first guardian appeared at the junction of 3 tunnels. It had once been human. Sarah could see that much in the general shape of limbs, the basic architecture of a face, but centuries of exposure to the Sleeping King's power had changed it into something else. Its skin was translucent, showing the fire that burned in its veins instead of blood. Its eyes were holes in reality, and when it opened its mouth to speak, only flames came out. "Phoenix-born," it said, the words crackling like burning wood. "Why do you walk the deep paths?" "I seek Lyra, Sarah replied, keeping her own fire carefully controlled. "The first guardian. I would speak with her." "Speak?" The creature that had once been Phoenix-born laughed, and the sound was like a forest fire consuming everything in its path. "She has not spoken in 1,000 years. She dreams now, dreams of binding and sacrifice and the weight of duty. Then I'll wake her up. You cannot. She is bound too deeply, connected too completely. To wake her is to wake him, and to wake him is to damn us all." The guardian moved closer, and Sarah could see that its feet didn't quite touch the ground. It drifted like smoke, like the memory of fire given semi-solid form. "Turn back, sister. Take your companions and return to the world above. Forget what you came here to learn. I can't do that. Then you will join us in madness, and your fire will burn alongside ours in endless, meaningless vigil." The guardian lunged forward, and Sarah discovered that fighting someone who was made of fire was significantly different from fighting normal enemies. Its touch was acid and ice and burning all at once. Where it grabbed her arm, her skin blistered and froze simultaneously, but her own fire responded with interest rather than pain, reaching out to merge with the guardian's flames like old friends meeting again. For a moment, she felt what the guardian felt, centuries of solitude, of watching and waiting, of slow dissolution as the boundary between self and duty eroded beyond recognition. The madness wasn't cruelty or evil. It was the simple, inevitable result of carrying a burden too heavy for any single consciousness to bear. "I understand," she whispered, and meant it. The guardian stopped its attack, its hollow eyes widening. "You understand? The loneliness, the fear, the weight of keeping something contained that should never have existed in the first place." Sarah let her fire merge more completely with the guardian's, sharing strength instead of fighting for dominance. But understanding doesn't mean accepting. There has to be another way. "There is no other way," the guardian said, but its voice carried less certainty than before. "There's always another way. We just haven't found it yet." For a long moment, the guardian was silent. Then it stepped back, its flames dimming to a barely visible flicker. "Pass, sister. But know that what you seek to wake has been sleeping for good reason, and know that some duties, once accepted, cannot be undone." As they moved deeper into the tunnel complex, passing more guardians who let them through with increasingly complex challenges and warnings, Sarah found herself wondering if the creature had been right. Maybe some duties couldn't be undone, but maybe they could be shared. Chapter 9. The Heart of Dreams. The chamber of the Sleeping King was a cathedral of impossible architecture. Sarah stood at the threshold, her fire dimming to barely visible embers as she tried to process what lay before them. The space was vast, too vast to exist this far beneath London, defying every law of physics and engineering. Crystalline formations jutted from walls that curved away into misty distance, and the ceiling was lost in shadows that seemed to move with their own purpose. At the center of it all, on a dais carved from what looked like a single massive pearl, lay two figures. The first was clearly inhuman, tall beyond mortal proportions, with skin like polished obsidian and hair that moved like liquid silver. Even in sleep, power radiated from him in waves that made the air itself seem thick and dangerous. This was the Sleeping King, the ancient hunger that had terrorized the world 2 millennia ago. Beside him, her hand resting on his chest, lay Lyralai. She was beautiful in the way that very old things were beautiful, worn smooth by time, refined by centuries of purpose. Her auburn hair was the same shade as Sarah's, and when Sarah moved closer, she could see the family resemblance in the shape of her face, the curve of her mouth. But it was the third figure that made Sarah's breath catch. Kneeling at the foot of the dais, as if in eternal supplication, was another vampire, ancient beyond measure, with features that might once have been noble, but were now twisted by millennia of grief and guilt. "Who is that?" she whispered. Lord Ashford moved to stand beside her, his expression carefully controlled. "That would be my sire, the one who created me, who taught me about duty and sacrifice and the weight of impossible choices." He's been here all this time? He's been here since the binding was created, keeping vigil, making sure nothing disturbs the balance. Lord Ashford's voice carried a pain so old it had crystallized into something almost like peace. I told you that Phoenix-born and vampires who bond deeply change each other. This is what that change looks like when carried to its logical conclusion. Sarah studied the three figures, seeing now the lines of connection that bound them together. Threads of power and commitment and love so deep it had transcended normal understanding. Not just Le Rallet holding the Sleeping King in check, but the ancient vampire lord sharing the burden, all three locked in an eternal dance of containment and sacrifice. We're interrupting something sacred, Helena said quietly. Of all of them, she seemed most affected by the sight, her newly mortal perspective making her sensitive to nuances the others missed. Or we're completing it, Cassius countered. Look at the patterns in the crystal formations, the way the power flows through the chamber. This isn't a stable binding, it's a slow-motion collapse. The original triangle is failing. He was right. Now that Sarah looked more carefully, she could see the cracks in the crystalline structures, the places where the containment field was beginning to fray. Lyralay's breathing was barely perceptible, her life force so attenuated it was more suggestion than reality. How do we wake her without waking him? Sarah asked. You don't, Lysander said from where he'd collapsed near the chamber entrance. His lucid moments were becoming more frequent, as if proximity to so much raw power was clarifying his fractured mind. That's the point of the binding. Their dreams are connected. Wake one. Wake both. Then we wake both and deal with the consequences. Sarah, Lord Ashford began. No. She turned to face him, fire blooming around her hands with deliberate intent. We came here to find answers. The only way to get them is to talk to someone who has them, and the only person who understands this situation completely is asleep on that dais. If you wake him, he'll be hungry. Violently, impossibly hungry after 2,000 years of enforced sleep. The binding has been containing not just his consciousness, but his need to feed. Then we make sure he has something to feed on that won't hurt anyone. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Lord Ashford stared at her, understanding dawning in his storm-gray eyes. You're talking about offering yourself. I'm talking about offering myself as a temporary measure while we figure out a permanent solution. Sarah moved toward the dais, her fire casting dancing shadows on the crystal walls. Phoenix blood is supposed to be incredibly nourishing, right? And I heal fast, regenerate quickly. I could probably sustain him long enough for a conversation. That's insane, Helena said flatly. That's practical, Sarah corrected. We need information. Information requires consciousness. Consciousness requires feeding. I'm the only one here who can survive being fed on by something that powerful. You don't know that, Lord Ashford said urgently. You don't know what he'll do when he wakes. The hunger could override everything else, consume you completely before you have a chance to establish any kind of communication. Then stay close and be ready to pull me back if things go wrong. She didn't wait for permission. Instead, she placed her hands on the crystalline dais and let her fire flow into the ancient structure. Not burning, not destroying, but warming, gently coaxing the binding toward wakefulness rather than trying to shatter it outright. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Power flooded through the chamber like a tsunami, making the crystal formations ring like bells, and sending waves of pressure that drove everyone except Sarah to their knees. The Sleeping King's eyes opened, ancient beyond measure, hungry beyond description, aware beyond human understanding. When his gaze found hers, Sarah felt the full weight of 2 millennia of enforced slumber crash down on her consciousness like a falling mountain. Who dares? The voice came from inside her skull, bypassing her ears entirely. It carried harmonics of rage and confusion, and a hunger so vast it made her previous understanding of the word seem laughably inadequate. Someone who wants to help, she said aloud, her voice steady despite the pressure trying to crush her mind into fragments. The Sleeping King sat up slowly, his movements fluid despite the length of his rest. Beside him, Lyralay stirred as well, her connection to his consciousness drawing her toward wakefulness. At the foot of the dais, the ancient vampire lord raised his head, recognition and terror warring in his expression. Help. The sleeping king's mental voice carried bitter amusement. The last one who offered help bound me in dreams for 20 centuries. Why should I trust another phoenix-born? Because I'm not offering to bind you, Sarah replied. I'm offering to feed you, temporarily, while we discuss alternatives to eternal imprisonment. The hunger in his gaze intensified, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken in response. Not fear, exactly, but recognition of a predator whose attention had focused completely on her. And what makes you think you would survive such feeding? Because I'm not trying to control you or contain you. I'm trying to understand you. Sarah stepped closer to the dais, ignoring Lord Ashford's sharp intake of breath. Tell me why you're different from other vampires. Tell me why you require so much more than blood to sustain yourself. For a moment, the sleeping king was silent. Then something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, at being asked rather than condemned. Because I was not made, he said finally. I simply was. The first of my kind, born from humanity's collective fear of death and darkness and the things that hunt in the night. I require not just blood, but life force itself, the spark that makes existence more than mere biological function. And feeding that way kills people, yes, but it also understands them, completely. I carry within me the memories, the experiences, the essential nature of everyone I have ever fed upon. 20,000 years of human consciousness, layered like sediment in my mind. The admission hit Sarah like a revelation. He wasn't just a predator, he was a repository. A living archive of everyone he had ever consumed, carrying their hopes and fears and dreams as part of his own consciousness. That's why you're so powerful, she breathed. And why you're so alone, loneliness. His laugh was like breaking stone. I contain multitudes, phoenix-born. How could I be lonely? Because they're all dead. All those memories, all those experiences. They're echoes, not companions. You carry the weight of 20,000 lives, but none of them can actually connect with you anymore. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Lirelai, now fully awake and watching from where she lay, seemed to hold her breath. Finally, the sleeping king spoke again, his mental voice softer than before. You understand? I understand isolation. I understand carrying burdens that no one else can share. Sarah extended her hand toward him, fire dancing around her fingers. But I also understand that understanding doesn't have to mean accepting. There might be another way. What way? Let me feed you. Let me experience what you experience when you consume life force. Maybe between the two of us, we can figure out how to satisfy your hunger without requiring death. The sleeping king stared at her extended hand for a long moment. Then, with movements that were almost reverent, he reached out and took it. The world exploded into sensation. Chapter 10. The choice of Fire Sarah had expected pain. Instead, what she felt when the sleeping king's consciousness touched hers was overwhelming completeness. Every emotion she'd ever experienced, every memory she'd ever formed, every fleeting thought that had ever crossed her mind, all of it suddenly had context. Connection, meaning beyond her individual perspective. She was still herself, but she was also more than herself. She could feel the king's hunger. Yes, but she could also feel the terrible loneliness that drove it. The desperate need not just for sustenance, but for understanding. For someone who could comprehend the weight of carrying 20,000 lives worth of memories and experiences. Do you see? His mental voice whispered through her consciousness. Do you understand why I cannot simply... Stop? She did see. The hunger wasn't cruelty or evil. It was necessity. Like breathing, like heartbeat, like the basic functions that kept existence possible. He required the life force of others not by choice, but by nature. But she also saw something else. Something he couldn't see himself, buried as it was beneath millennia of isolation and guilt. You're not just taking, she realized. You're preserving. Every person you fed on, their essence is still alive within you, still experiencing, still growing, still capable of connection. They are dead, he replied, but she could feel uncertainty beneath the words. No, they're transformed. Just like I'm being transformed by touching your consciousness. They've been transformed by becoming part of yours. The understanding bloomed in her mind like fire catching tinder. You're not a predator. You're a collector, a preserver, the living memory of humanity itself. Around them, the crystal chamber began to resonate with new harmonics. The binding that had held the sleeping king for 2 millennia was responding to this shift in understanding, the ancient magic recognizing that something fundamental had changed. Even if that were true, the king said, "The transformation still requires their death. I still take their lives to sustain my own." "Then don't take death," Sarah said simply. "Take willing transformation." The concept hit both their consciousnesses simultaneously, not forced consumption, but chosen transcendence. People who were dying anyway, people who wanted their experiences and memories to live on, offering themselves freely to become part of something larger than individual existence. It would work. Lyraleigh's voice joined their mental conversation. She had been listening, understanding, following the thread of their shared revelation. The magic doesn't require death. It requires willing surrender of individual form. If people chose transformation, the hunger would be satisfied without murder, the sleeping king finished. But who would make such a choice? Who would willingly give up individual existence to become part of a collective consciousness? Sarah thought of her parents, dying in the fire that had awakened her powers, of all the people she'd seen in the workhouse, wasting away from disease and despair, of the countless humans throughout history who had faced death with the knowledge that everything they were would simply end. "More people than you'd think," she said. "If the alternative was meaningful immortality as part of something vast and important." The binding was definitely changing now. Sarah could feel it loosening, the ancient containment field recognizing that the thing it had been built to hold was no longer quite the same thing. The sleeping king was still incredibly powerful, still capable of draining life from entire cities if he chose. But the choice itself had changed. "This could work," he said, wonder creeping into his mental voice. "A covenant of willing transformation, consent freely given. Yes, this could satisfy the hunger without requiring unwilling death, but it would require trust," Lyrelei pointed out. From humans who have been taught to fear vampires for millennia, who would believe that such an offer was genuine? Sarah looked around the chamber, taking in her companions. Lord Ashford, ancient and guilt-ridden but decent to his core. Cassius, ambitious but not evil. Helena, stripped of her vampire nature but still possessing centuries of knowledge. Lysander, mad but insightful in his madness. "We would," she said. "We'd be the proof of concept, the demonstration that such a covenant could work." "You're talking about creating a new kind of vampire society," the ancient lord at the foot of the dais said, speaking aloud for the first time, one based on voluntary transformation rather than predation. "Not vampire," Sarah corrected, also returning to spoken words. "Something new, something that's never existed before." She was still connected to the sleeping king's consciousness, still sharing his perspective and understanding, but she could also feel her own individual will, her own choices and desires remaining intact. The connection didn't erase identity, it expanded it. "A collective of willing consciousnesses," Lord Ashford said slowly, beginning to understand. "People who choose to become part of something larger while retaining their essential selves." "It would need structure," Cassius added, his tactical mind already working through the implications. "Safeguards to ensure genuine consent, methods for maintaining individual identity within the collective, ways to prevent abuse or coercion. And it would need Phoenix-born to mediate," Lyralee said, sitting up fully for the first time in centuries, "to maintain the balance between individual and collective, to ensure the king's hunger is satisfied without overwhelming the human consciousnesses that join with him." Sarah felt the rightness of it settling into her bones like truth recognizing itself. This was what she'd been meant to find, not a choice between death, imprisonment, or corruption, but a fourth option that transformed the entire nature of the problem. "The binding won't be necessary anymore," she said. "If the king has willing sustenance, if he's no longer driven to unwilling predation, there's no need to contain him." "But the transition will be dangerous," the sleeping king warned. 2,000 years of enforced slumber, of pent-up hunger. Releasing the binding entirely could still result in catastrophic feeding if my control slips even momentarily. "Then we don't release it all at once," Sarah said. "We modify it, change it from a prison into a..." governance structure, something that helps maintain the balance while the new system establishes itself. The ancient vampire lord at the foot of the dais slowly stood, his movements careful after so many centuries of motionless vigil. That would require phoenix fire of incredible precision, he said. The kind of control that takes centuries to develop. Or, Sarah said, looking around at her companions, it would require multiple phoenix-born working together, sharing the burden instead of carrying it alone. She could feel it now. The potential connections, the threads of power that could link her not just to the sleeping king, but to others of her kind. Helena, stripped of vampire nature, but still carrying the potential for transformation. Lysander, whose madness might actually be a form of enhanced perception. Even Lord Ashford, bound to her through their developing trust and connection. You're talking about creating an entire new species, Helena said, her voice filled with awe and terror in equal measure. No, Sarah corrected. I'm talking about becoming what we were always meant to be. Phoenix-born weren't just individuals with fire magic. We were mediators, bridges between human and supernatural. We were meant to facilitate transformation, not prevent it. The sleeping king's mental voice carried surprised recognition. The original purpose. Before the Phoenix Wars, before the persecution and scattering, your people were the shepherds of willing change. And we can be again, Sarah said, if we choose to be. She looked around the chamber one more time, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Lord Ashford, no longer seeking death but transformation. Cassius, calculating but beginning to see the potential for something greater than individual power. Helena, mortal again, but not necessarily permanently. Lysander, mad but perhaps mad with visions of what could be rather than what was. And at the center of it all, the sleeping king and Lyrelei, no longer bound by duty alone but by shared purpose and willing connection. So, Sarah said, fire dancing around her hands as she prepared to begin reshaping 2,000 years of binding magic. Who wants to help me build a better world?